All right, everyone, welcome back to the latest episode of the Monarchs Tribunal. Today with me, I have the Well Red Mage over from the Pixel, or is it the Pixels?
The pixels. That's close enough. Somebody looked up. I had to name the site after that stupid movie that came out not too long ago. I think that might have just been Pixels, but we're the Pixels. So, yeah.
But yes, today we're going to be talking about the term JRPG, which has become strangely contentious.
It sure has. Surprisingly controversial. A lot of my studies recently, a lot of research has been in categorization and genre and subgenre, and people have like surprisingly emotional reactions to what's essentially taxonomy. Uh, where they will want to fight you over what they consider to be an RPG versus not an RPG, and I think that's fairly unique to this subset of genres. Like I've never met anybody who is like, "Oh, that's not a first-person shooter," and also, "How dare you?" You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It seems uniquely RPG-esque.
Now, that said, something I think we should probably get out of the way first is it's something I found out a bit when talking with one of my other co-hosts about it, Mildra the Monk. A lot of people came into across the actual term JRPGs in a noticeably different way.
Interesting. How do you mean?
Like for him, like his first exposure to the term was around the era of like the PS3 and 360 when a lot of your
Oh,
magazines start or not magazines, your online outlets started using it.
okay. So that's remarkably late. I would say. Um,
Yeah, it's one of those
it,
things that people tend to forget about some of the earlier internet is things were a lot more segmented than people remember.
yeah. Now I wasn't a ton on the internet back in the day. I want to say that we were calling RPGs Japanese RPGs, if that's what they were. But I admit to not having like a normative childhood and a normative relationship to video games. Uh, Growing up in Hawaii, we had things kind of like came a little later. You know, it takes a while for stuff to get out there. But then at the same time, there's a very significant Japanese population in Hawaii. So I got to watch, anime in Japanese before it was officially out in English because I had friends who, could speak Japanese. And same thing with certain games. Like I remember being real young and some guy at a shop was telling me how to cut the pegs out of my Super Nintendo so I could play Super Famicom games. Um, and so stuff like when did the term JRPG first appear is I think a little tricky to answer. I feel like it's a lot earlier than PS3 era though.
Yeah, like for me, I remember it around the time like between the transition to the PS1 to PS2 was the
Mhm.
first time I'd started hearing that term online.
Okay. Yeah. And like to my mind that sounds super late, but I don't have like evidence right now
Yeah.
like at my fingertips, for that. I I was so again like studying RPGs a lot recently. I want to say with a lot of the Super Nintendo era magazine scans that I've looked at recently that there were journalists making the distinction of specifically Japanese RPGs. They'd say things like as a Japanese RPG or because it's a Japanese RPG. Um, I couldn't tell you like page number off the top of my head. You know what I mean?
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah, but I want to say it was being used. I want to say it was being used in the '90s. Um, Fairly confident about.
It said like I can actually understand why there are people right now who have like a much more vitriolic reaction to the term if when you came into it was around the online magazine scenes of, again, that PS3 and 360 era. 'Cause I don't know if you were
Right.
reading many of those articles, but they drew such a distinction between Western and Japanese RPG, almost like
Yeah.
they were two completely different and unrelated things.
I think by the time you get to that era, um, there were definitely people who were using the term in a derogatory sense. And that's a big part of the discussion too, and people's feelings on the matter is how it's potentially been used. I'll say in a discriminatory fashion. But I don't think that's the original use of the term, and I don't even think it's really the either the most useful use of the term or the most widespread use of the term. I think round about those generations that you're talking about, mainstream Western games journalism, uh, you know, would start to sort of tease JRPGs uh, in their writings and in their reporting, like, it's a JRPG. Guess that means whiny anime voices and all these things, um, which isn't to be unexpected even today in the way that uh, games journalism will rage bait and clickbait people and hate bait them and stuff like that, by saying overly sensational and dramatic things. Um, and then too, the conversation was further uh, injected with layers of emotion. Let's say when Yoshi P recently came out to say that he felt the term was discriminatory. Um, and I met people who were like, "Oh, we need to stop using this term." And I was like, "Can you name any other Japanese developer who has said this?" Though, like when somebody tells me that they feel discriminated against racially, I'll believe them. Like I'm not saying I don't believe Yoshi P or saying that he made up the statement that he doesn't really feel that way or anything like that. That's not what I mean. But I also don't think that he speaks for every Japanese developer. Um, and that was sort of cemented in my mind immediately afterwards. I think it was the following week after that, very controversial statement that the internet blew up and went viral and everything. Everybody knew about that statement. But then a much quieter statement came out of Hironobu Sakaguchi, and it's paradoxically the old creator of Final Fantasy versus the new creator of Final Fantasy. But Sakaguchi discussed how he was proud of the cultural backdrop that's in JRPGs and delighted that he gets to share those aspects of his ethnicity through the games that he creates, which when I read it I was like, oh, this is almost like the antithesis of what Yoshi P said. So folks who will want to say that JRPG is a racist term or a discriminatory term, it depends on who you ask. It can be used as a discriminatory term. And again, I think that's referencing those mainstream journalists from from the PS3 era and stuff like that. But there are other Japanese developers who feel a different way.
Now, see, to a degree, I'm kind of on the side. I don't like how the term gets used. It's not so much as how you see a lot of people use it. They're like, when I became familiar with the term, it was kind of just a shorthand for, look, if you like JRPGs, they tend to be more focused, not quite as open, like, your Final Fantasies and that, where your Western RPGs are far more open in what they're going to allow you to do, a la Elder Scrolls.
Right. Yeah,
But,
those differences are fair to mention, and that's a whole subject there in itself. I assume you'll want to unpack all that.
yeah, but as time went on, though, for some reason it became a lot more of an identifier in a way I don't think was useful. Like, you'll see a lot of games these days where, you'll look on Steam, you'll see the categories or tags, and it'll have JRPG in it. Like, what does that actually tell me about your game?
That's the big question in it. I think that most of the time when you're talking about like 30, 40, 50 years of video game history, like 95% of the time, you're going to be able to tell the difference. If not at a glance, then with an understanding of the structure of the story, its themes, and its gameplay. Right now, like when you think of a CRPG, which is actually a term that I'm more against than JRPG. CRPG as like a computer RPG makes no sense. It did once upon a time when, they were making a distinction between the PC RPG and RPGs that you would have on like a home console. But once they start porting those to console, like what is a computer RPG on a console? A console RPG? It sort of just kind of loses its distinguishing power.
Yeah.
But when it comes to JRPGs, though, this is where I fall in line with Sakaguchi-san. I think that there's absolutely a cultural backdrop that influences the design philosophies and structures that are implemented into JRPGs. So, I think a good way to start this conversation, because that's a big conversation, is like
Yeah.
what is usually different in JRPGs compared to CRPGs or Western RPGs. Some people like to say WRPGs these days. A good way to start that off is like compare games with food. Like if you think games are art, there's also cuisine as art. Food can be art as well. Um, and I like to make the aside. Some people will say, well, there's no objectivity in games because they're art. And it's like, well, if you think food is art, there's definitely objectivity in food. Like if you undercook chicken, you will die. You will get sick. Like you'll throw up. There's an objective way to prepare chicken, so you do not, make the person consuming it get sick. And I think that there's an analogy for that in games. But as far as JRPGs and food goes, can you tell the difference between Long John Silver's fish and sushi?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I imagine you can, because they come from different areas of the world and they have different cultural kind of means and traditions of preparation and execution and history, so that like the difference between Kentucky Fried Chicken and say like chicken chow mein. Like you can tell they come from different areas of the world. They have different ideas and that sort of thing. Now, that's not to say that there aren't fusions, right? In food, there's fusions of cuisine. Again, something that was impressed upon me in Hawaii, and where a small place in which a lot of cultures will intermix, and so you have mixtures of foods that create new kinds of foods. And we can expect to see that in games as well if they're art, because art does that. It mixes together and it creates new things. Like, we can tell the difference between like Renaissance art that was produced in Europe and ukiyo-e that was produced in Japan, because they're two different kinds of art despite the fact that they're both art. I think the same thing with games. We can typically tell what is a JRPG, not because it was just made in Japan, but because it's Japanese in identity distinctly. And there are some instances in which a developer in Japan will try to make a game like a Western RPG, or a Western developer will try to make a game like a Japanese RPG. But I think that those exceptions are typically pointed out. People will go, what about Dark Souls? Once you say, what about Dark Souls, you're responding to a perceived standard. You're stating an exception. And if there is an exception, then that means that there's a rule. And so that's typically the logic of my argument, right? If you're naming an exception, there is a rule that that thing is accepting. It seems at least to make sense in my mind. But I know that was a lot of word vomit there. So yeah, I don't know what you think.
See, while I understand the argument, I don't know if this is a great way to do this because a lot of what we know for JRPGs or things people associate with just JRPGs in general, that wasn't Japanese in nature. You can trace the origins back to what were the two series? Why did I just blank these? Ultima and
Are you
Wizardry.
talking? Oh, right. Yeah,
So
and
Japan
that's
wasn't even the origin for what a lot of people tend to associate with JRPG.
right. Now let me comment on that. Okay, I don't think that Japan needs to have originated JRPGs in order for us to use the term JRPG. I don't think they need to have originated the genre RPG in order for us to use the term JRPG. And going back to the painting example, right? Like, say Europe had invented art, but Japan had, kind of taken that idea and run with it in their own direction, and they created ukiyo-e, these woodcut illustrations. That would still be art. It's just, a different interpretation of art. And so, what you're referencing is real history, and with that history that you're referencing, you're making a distinction, right? So you pinpointed Ultima, Wizardry, these super early CRPG uh, things. And what you had with Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, games like that, is they reinterpreted those, but with different sort of creation of new traditions, right? And you mentioned a few of those things earlier. Brighter colors, more linear, an emphasis on rebuilt characters rather than creating your own player avatar, that sort of thing. And those traits, though, are general traits, because essentially we're talking about a subgenre here, right? Like RPG is the genre. CRPG, WRPG, JRPG, action RPG, tactical RPG, strategy RPG. Those are all sub genres, right? Because they're interpretations of the core. And then one could ask, well, what is the core? And I don't know. Like the first RPG, I guess, would probably was an Ultima. It would have been like a text adventure.
Yeah.
Things have definitely evolved since then.
See, one thing you did there though, you mentioned like of the subgenres, you said JRPG, strategy
Yeah.
RPG. People look
Yes.
at strategy RPGs like they are JRPGs.
In what
I
in what way? Like, what do you mean?
like when someone says JRPG, that you're gonna have people who hear that and they're gonna think of things like Final Fantasy Tactics, Ogre Battle,
Right.
March of the Black Queen. People don't view JRPG and strategy RPG as two separate things.
Right. I see what you mean. Now, question is, do you want to hang a definition on what we would perceive people as viewing it? Because
See, that's where it gets hard with the term
it gets
JRPG.
it gets tricky, right? Because, like, as you can see, like, we're in disagreement, but then once you multiply that by millions of people worldwide, you cannot define these terms based on majority rules. Because one, we don't know what the majority is. Nobody can pull that right now. At least not with our reach. But like maybe they could do it on Twitter and have like, well, even then, Twitter's not the whole population of gamers. But what has to be done, I think, for these terms is defining them historically based on how they developed. Like you said, we know that Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest developed from a lineage of Ultima and Wizardry. They just were a reinterpretation of that based on Japanese thought. So knowing that, I think, is a better foundation for how we use these terms and how we define these terms, not, you know, a perceived number of people who are either using these terms in a correct way or misusing these terms or are just flat out confused about these terms. Because it may just be historical illiteracy, You know, and like I've encountered that. I've met people who have said the RPG genre doesn't exist. Like, you know, I've met people who say everything is an RPG because you play a role. Now, are they right? Would they be right if most of the planet's population believed that? I don't think so. I would think it would just mean most of the planet's population is wrong.
Yeah. At the same time, though, with the JRPG, I don't think this has ever actually had a definition, which creates an interesting discussion. Like, how do you draw the line?
It has had a definition, and it's Japanese RPGs. Because
No.
it's an acronym,
Yeah.
right? It's not like well, consider it this way. Japanese RPG means, you know, something as literal as first person shooter. You know, would you buy a first person shooter and expect a game like Super Mario World? No. Would you buy a JRPG and expect Ultima 1? No. And that is sort of the general understanding of these two terms. I don't think that the term JRPG itself carries all the meaning of what a JRPG can be, but I think it literally has a meaning.
See, I would say, if, especially if you didn't know the lineage, if you got a JRPG and got Ultima 1, I don't think it'd be that far out of expectations.
Well,
That far.
like I've played Final Fantasy 1 and I've dabbled in Ultima 1, and I don't think that they're, like, you can tell they're in the same lineage of genre,
Yeah.
but I don't think that they're in the same subcategory.
See,
A closer example is, with studies in Super Nintendo RPGs right now. There are Western RPGs on the Super Nintendo. A lot of people remember, you know, Final Fantasy VI and Chrono Trigger and Secret of Mana and Terra Enigma. Great games, wonderful games. There are also pretty good Western RPGs on there as well. Eye of the Beholder, Dungeon Master. These are first-person dungeon crawlers, which were big back then for the Western RPG category. Now, there is a first-person dungeon crawler that's Japanese in origin, right? And that's Arcana. But if you put Arcana and say Eye of the Beholder side by side, you would absolutely be able to tell which one is Western and which one is Japanese. Like 100%. They're just completely different games, despite the fact that you first person dungeon crawl in both of them.
see, I see what you're saying there. Like, this is kind of how I would say JRPG is kind of would be a useful term. Is if you look at it like you would look at someone saying anime. Like, if I were to ask you, real quick, let's pretend for a second I've never played an RPG before in my life. It's like,
Okay.
hey, I want to get into JRPGs. Where would I start?
If you've never played an RPG before and you want to get into JRPGs, where would you start?
Yeah.
That's the question.
Yeah. How would you
Okay.
respond to that question?
Yeah, I would say starting with simple examples would be great. I think, again, with Super Nintendo on the mind, I think Mario RPG and Final Fantasy Mystic Quest are excellent starter RPGs. I'll say starter JRPGs specifically.
So why that, and why not a strategy RPG or an action RPG?
Yeah, I think that's for a couple reasons. Okay, so this is something I've thought about a lot, especially since I've got two young kids. Figuring out where to start them with RPGs is an important question. So both Mystic Quest and Super Mario RPG are relatively simple for their categories and subcategories. Mario RPG has the benefit of having a recognizable IP attached to it. Kids love Mario, adults love Mario. people will recognize the character and therefore have some kind of attachment to that potentially. Mario RPG also has fairly simple readable dialogue. It's very straightforward and linear. It does not have an extremely complex battle system, which is why I wouldn't recommend a strategy RPG. Um, if you asked me to recommend an RPG, I would recommend a more complex one. But if you asked me to recommend you a starter RPG or your first JRPG, I would certainly recommend something that's simpler, that has an easier reading comprehension, um, which is also why I would choose Mystic Quest too. Mystic Quest is not the best Final Fantasy on the Super Nintendo. Sorry, kids, it's just not. But Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was designed with beginners in mind, and that gives it a special utility. So I recommend those two, not because they're not strategy RPGs, not because they're not action RPGs, but because they're simple. Strategy RPGs tend to be a lot more complex. Action RPGs can tend to have an extra level of requiring reflexes and skills that traditional turn-based JRPGs do not require.
No, I would say something like Secret of Mana is just as easy to get into, to be honest, because it is still very
Potentially,
simple.
it is. I don't know if you have kids. Do you?
I don't.
Okay, so I've tested this. This is a real thing. Real time is fun, and when you say easy to get into, if you're talking about fun factor, it's there. Secret of Mana is fun. What I've found is that younger people tend to, and I'm not making the assumption that if you asked for a starter JRPG, you're young, but for a lot of people who are playing their first RPG, they're going to be young because most adults have played RPGs if they're gamers at this point. Uh, there's there's a tendency to tend to panic. Secret of Mana definitely has hitbox issues that could be frustrating. It does certainly have a more complex inventory and menu system. So looking at, I'm not saying that those are like deal breaker issues. Like you can absolutely start a kid off on for sure. It's not like as complex as like a Devil May Cry hack and slash or anything like that. But if you're asking me for the simplest, most accessible, I would definitely say turn-based. I would definitely say Mario Mystic Quest.
Now, I'll ask you another very similar question. As I said, I'd
Yeah.
compare JRPG to anime. Say I've never seen an anime. Where do I start?
Well, so one, I don't study anime. um, uh, if you've never seen an anime, and you're an adult now, because I think we have to make different assumptions about the different art form, right? Than just games. Like with games, if it's your first RPG, I'm thinking about ease of reading, ease of systems, navigation, battle, complexity, all that sort of thing. Whereas we don't have to navigate a UI when we watch anime, you know? You don't have to worry about like a really like tweaky battle system or anything like that in an anime because you're just passively watching. So if you were an adult and it was your first anime, I would recommend Cowboy Bebop. It's one of my favorites. Best thing about it is it's short, so you're not recommending somebody a billion episodes to get through.
Yeah.
You're recommending something that's what is it like
24
30?
episodes.
Oh, 24. See, I was already way off. But so that's manageable. I think it's adult in a way that isn't gratuitous or potentially off-putting to people. It's thoughtful and pensive. If you were younger, Pokemon again, because you benefit from the IP recognition. It's fairly simple, very Saturday morning cartoonish. But I wouldn't recommend like. Let's see, I'm trying to think of something like. Perfect Blue. I don't know.
You see,
It's hard to say. But I do want to know your point in asking those two questions.
the point is like For example, if I were to be asked either one of those, the first thing I'd respond with is, what kind of things do you enjoy?
Hmm.
Because let's say someone's like, "Oh, I want to get into like these JRPGs. What do I do?" It's like, I wouldn't follow up with like, "Okay, what are some good games in all of JRPGs?" It's,
Right.
what kind of stuff do you enjoy? Like, if you want something a bit faster, a little more action or twitch based, I might start recommending some action RPGs. If there's someone who likes to take their time, a bit more patient, plot things out, I might recommend somebody a strategy RPG to start with, because there's a number of ones that are simple enough and easy to understand.
Right.
Like, there's no reason you would pick like a turn-based over that, and it'd be the same thing with anime. Like, I'm not necessarily going to recommend Bebop first, as much as I love Bebop, because say someone said one of their favorite films was Silence of the Lambs, they wanted to get into anime, I might recommend something like Monster.
Right. Right. Right.
Because
So if
both anime and JRPG are such broad streaming categories, I think it's really hard to nail down like where you would even start without more information. At which point I think the term somewhat starts to lose any use.
right. So here's how I interpreted your question is that I wasn't allowed to ask a follow-up question. If because again, if you just asked me what should be my first RPG and that's the question, I'll answer it. If we're able to have a conversation, that's even better, right? Because then
Yes.
you can sort of specialize. So your point is that the term is too broad. Is that how I'm reading it?
To a degree, yes. Like,
Okay.
when you're just
What would
talking in general, like, as a lot of people will talk about animes, I
uh
think the term JRPG is entirely fine. It's fit enough for purpose for like a general broad conversation. The moment you try to like get too specific and categorize what that is, that's when I think it starts becoming kind of pointless. Because when you start doing that, you're already going to have to start using terms like your turn-based RPGs, your actions,
right.
Souls-like in the
And
more modern era.
those are defining. I mean, they had action RPGs back
Yeah.
in early 90s. The earliest action RPG I could find was 1979. So they've had them. But I get what you're saying. I think there is absolutely an acknowledgement that it's a very broad
Yeah.
category. Um, but if broadness prevented us from using terms, then we definitely need to throw out RPG. Because if JRPG is broad, my friend, RPG
Oh yeah.
is broad. But take it back to the food example, right? So if it's too broad to recommend, there's different kinds of sushi. There's a tremendous variety, not just of fish, but of different ways to
Yep.
prepare them. So if if the point is, where do I start with sushi? There's too much of it, therefore we should stop using the
Yeah.
delineation. I don't necessarily follow that logic.
Again, it's more like the context is getting used in. Like, as I mentioned it earlier on, you will see Steam games have JRPG in their tags that they will use. If I'm looking for a specific type of game, and I already am familiar with JRPGs, I'm going to look at that and not know what I'm going to get out of the game. I'm not going to know if it's turn based, action, strategy, or any of those other things you could attribute to JRPGs. There's so many tropes, it's not telling me.
Right. Well, same thing for CRPGs.
Yeah.
If it's listed as CRPG, that doesn't tell you if it's a turn-based RPG. That doesn't
Yeah.
tell you if it's, this or that. In the same way that like you might be looking for sci-fi first-person shooters, but FPS alone doesn't tell you that.
Yeah.
But that's why we have multiple clarifiers, right? So there's no need for
Yeah.
JRPG alone to
Yeah.
convey everything that can possibly be in a JRPG because we have other clarifiers like
Yeah.
turn-based or action or strategy, on and
Yeah.
on and on and on.
That's what I said. It's kind of the context in which you're talking where it becomes relevant. Like, it's just like anime. Like, I'll talk anime with people. I'll talk JRPGs with people. In just general
Right,
conversation, they're both great terms. They serve a
right.
function.
And you've got, in terms of anime, I mean, like, I'm old enough to remember when anime was called Japanimation. Uh, and you were a Japanophile. I don't know if we can say that anymore, but you remember that term? It was for people who really love Japanese culture, Japanophile.
Yeah.
Um, I think they swapped that out eventually because it does sound pretty weird. But um, some of my favorite Western shows were animated in Japan. Um, does that make them anime? I don't know. Batman the animated series. The real Ghostbusters. I was just watching the other night with my kids. Uh, I would absolutely call Batman the animated series a Western cartoon, but it was animated in Japan. And I think we have the capacity to make that distinction without leaving it solely at an acronym. So, like when you mentioned Steam, Steam categorization, I'm not sure where that takes place. So, like if you uploaded a game right now, do you tell Steam what category it is, or does Steam assign that?
You put in the categories yourself, and there's also a section for recommended categories from people who've played the game so they can kind of add their own collection of tags to it.
Got it. So that goes back to developers themselves and players not having a confident sense of what the genres mean. So, like, if anybody can put JRPG on there, then people are going to make mistakes, right? Because as we've discovered, people don't use these terms the same way. What I would argue for is not throwing out the terms, but in having developing a standardized definition for them so that they're more useful, not less.
See, I don't think we really need that for JRPG because we already have all those other subcategories. Like, again, action, turn based strategy. I
Well,
don't think a redefinition of JRPG is really going to be all that useful.
Right. I'm not saying redefinition. I'm saying standardization.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to redefine it. It is Japanese RPG. That should be just fine. There's two things that I want to bring up again in response to that, in rebuttal. One of them is, again, falling back on Sakaguchi-san. I would not want to take away from him the cultural identity that he's putting into these games that make these games unique. I think that's really valid, and I think like you can absolutely see that. You could see the cultural backdrop in JRPGs. The other thing is, I don't think that sort of base battle system descriptions are enough. So again, let's go back to the first-person dungeon crawlers, right? That I mentioned. We'll say Arcana, and we'll say Eye of the Beholder is the only other one I can remember right now. Let's just say, for the sake of this, those are two first-person dungeon crawlers. They're very different. Like, let's just say that they were both turn-based, and they're both dungeon crawlers. Now, how else do you account for the differences in them?
To a degree, the same way you'd account for the differences between wizardry and Eye of the Beholder. There's a vast difference between those two. Arguably
there
just
are,
as much.
I mean, in terms of presentation, execution, stuff like that. That's where I think Japanese RPG is useful, because you play Eye of the Beholder, it's a CRPG. You play Arcana, it's a JRPG. Again, it's in the same way that you eat at Long John Silver's, and
Yeah.
it's Long John Silver's, and you eat sushi, and it's sushi. There's both fish, and you can have tempura if you want to make it even closer analogy where they're both battered, but you can tell the differences in history and culture and backdrop and tradition and on and on and on and on. That's where I think it's useful, but if people make it the only descriptor, then it's not useful. And that's where I think a lot of people are making a mistake. If you only say, like, if you only lead with, you know, it's a JRPG. Again, that's too broad. But we have other descriptors. So that's why, to my brain, it's a non-issue.
I mean, to be fair, no matter where you come at this is kind of a non-issue. We're talking about a random
Right?
term
No,
on the
I don't
internet.
mean.
This is an entirely
mean,
pointless discussion.
Yeah, I don't mean in like a cosmic sense or like, you know, the rest of my life sense. When people say we should stop using the term JRPG, that's what I mean. I think that's not an issue. I don't find any reason that, like, I think we should stop using the term CRPG. I like WRPG just fine. If you want to refer specifically to a personal computer RPG only, CRPG. But this is why we have multiple subgenres. Yeah, this is why there's multiple ways to describe a game. I think that, you know, we don't have to take like a 1984 approach and eradicate one of the descriptors. We could just use multiple descriptors.
Yeah, see, I'm fine again with just in general conversation. I do think it's a useful enough term. Because there's differences between where something comes from.
Exactly.
We all know this. Cultures are different and all that. But then you get weird instances where, like, I'm a Western developer. I'm making a Japanese RPG. It's like, it's not coming from Japan. What are you talking about?
Yes. So there are two definitions then for JRPG, but essentially they both mean Japanese RPG. That can mean Japanese in origin, or it can mean Japanese in style. I would argue that in style is what Sakaguchi was talking about, and in style is more important and more descriptive than in origin, right? But I'm not Japanese, so I think if I was Japanese, I think the in origin would be more important. But in terms of categorization and description, in style is plenty fine. So, like, there's a specific example recently, right? Sea of Stars. Did you play Sea of Stars?
I did.
Yeah, what'd you think?
I think it was overrated, but it's a good game. That's a discussion for another day.
Yeah, that's another. No, it's interesting to hear. I didn't finish it myself. I thought it was beautiful, but there was a lot on my plate. It still is. But Sea of Stars is a game that was made in the West, that was made in the style of a Japanese role-playing game, and that's 100% like explicit. Like they specifically said to audiences multiple times, this is inspired by Chrono Trigger. Like, that was their tagline on marketing, right? Was a Chrono Trigger inspired RPG. That tells you right away that this is a JRPG in style, despite the fact that it was made in the West. Yeah. And then we see it the other way around too, right? People will be like, oh, what about Elden Ring and stuff like that? But that goes back to my original point. If you can identify the exception, then you're acknowledging the rule.
Yeah. That's why I said it still comes down to, it's a great term if you're, like, talking general, like, in the more general sense. As we've kind of done a lot when we've agreed on how it's getting used so far. It's not until it starts becoming like a core identity, like, I'm making a JRPG. It's like, no, you're making a game. You're making, like, a more specific genre of RPG that is borrowing a lot from JRPGs. You can probably lump it in with JRPGs, but if you just tell me JRPG, you could just take that out of your advertising, your descriptions, just tell me your influences in the more specific genres, and you've told me just as much as if you never included JRPG in, like, a core identity of your game.
Yeah, and it's potentially that the notion of core identity is unuseful.
Yeah.
you know, because I would categorize a lot of the things that we're talking about as subcategories. Like RPG is the main genre, um, and a lot of these things are subgenres, and that does not mean, going back to the discriminatory comment, that does not mean that JRPGs are somehow lesser, or inferior RPGs. I don't think so, and I think a lot of people don't believe that either. A lot of people's favorite games in the world are JRPGs, widely celebrated genre, or subgenre rather, for the sake of this conversation.
So that's really just kind of where I come down on is I think people try to tie it too closely to aspects of a game to the point it's not useful. Like it's great as again, I'm talking like cultural identity from Japan. Like you can clearly see a lot of that in the JRPGs. You you
Absolutely.
don't play games like that over here in the West. But at the same time, I don't think you're ever going to see someone make a distinction between like a Western first person shooter and a Japanese first person shooter. If that's even a
What's
thing.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Like, what's an example of like a Japanese? I don't play a lot of first person shooters. Oh,
Neither do
I
I.
know. I did think of one. It's Yoshi's Safari. Uh, that might actually
Yeah.
be no, that's first person. Yeah, yeah. Um, there's a third person shooter that I just thought of, and that's Dirge of Cerberus. Um, but yeah, I'm not an expert on shooters.
Yeah.
That's gonna have to have a different guest
I
on
think
for
that's
that.
another thing that's kind of unique to RPGs is using the countries of origin in the descriptions. I can't think
Yeah,
of shooters or any other kind of game like that where this would apply to.
I think like there's some of that in the mobile scene. Um,
Oh, I'm
and
completely
pachinkos
detached
and
from that scene.
yeah, I'm not an expert on that scene at all, but there are sort of distinct identities, I think, within that. There's an example that I could think of, not a mobile one, but an MMO that I was playing a while ago, that was Korean actually. Because believe it or not, like you know, more countries on the planet make video games than just Japan and like America and Europe. Like there's a range of countries that make video games, which is really cool. So like uh, this Korean game was Dungeon Fighter Online. X super cool. I haven't played it in years, so if it's changed, somebody correct me. But it was a super cool side-scrolling beat 'em up MMO RPG, which is as rad as that sounds. Uh, Fantastic game. But a Korean game. And I'm not an expert on Korea. I'm not an expert on many things. Let's say I keep saying that. I'm not an expert on many things. But I imagine that if you knew enough about Korea, you can begin to kind of pick out a Korean perspective on these things. And the reason why that cultural kind of angle I think is important to me as well. Like I mean a lot of mainlanders in America, mainlanders, continental U.S., who will say we don't have a culture, and I think they're just not noticing detail. Like there's a vast range of cultures that exist on the continental U.S. But from my perspective as an outsider, having grown up in the Pacific and then moving to the mainland as an adult, I can see that. And then I can see too, when somebody makes Hawaiian art, I know it's Hawaiian art because I can tell it comes from a Hawaiian perspective on life that draws from a Hawaiian tradition and a Hawaiian worldview, and of history and myth and belief and faith and all these things. I think that's really important. That is cultural identity that people belong to, and I don't think that we can really help to put that in our art. Now, sometimes you might have somebody sort of borrow another cultural identity and put that in there, but you're still talking about a cultural identity. And I think cultural identity is behind why JRPGs are still a relevant term.
I can agree with that. Like, what is it? There's this guy I've seen random shorts of, Josh from the UK. He basically talked about like when he came to America to do like a cross America road trip, and just a lot of it's some of the weird bits of just absolute culture shock. Like the idea of driving 2 hours to get somewhere was so insane and foreign to this guy.
Wow.
But you can drive across Texas the length of the UK and still be in Texas. Well, not the UK,
Yeah.
but pretty much Europe.
Yeah, no, mind blowing. To me, again, the island I grew up on, you could drive around the whole thing in like 6 hours.
Yeah.
Something like that. And then when we moved to Texas a couple of years ago, we spent like an entire day driving just in Texas. And I was like, you know what? Texas is a little too big. If you ask me. They need to chop that thing up.
But yeah, so culture is definitely going to have a huge impact, and that's where I think the term is useful.
Sweet.
But
I'm happy with that, honestly. I mean, like, once we talk about gaming systems, yeah, like JRPG doesn't define, just turn-based, right? And I'll meet people like that, who will say, like, oh, JRPGs are only like turn-based, so like action RPGs aren't JRPGs. I was like, what you just said makes no sense. Like, it doesn't make any sense at all. Those are not overriding terms, or they're not like mutually exclusive terms. They're terms that work together.
Yeah, so I think we both agree, like, using the term like in the broader sense, useful, perfectly fine.
Yeah.
But when you get too specific with it, it doesn't really matter. Like, most people actually, I think it's easy for us who are online so much to forget. The vast majority of people care about none of this.
Yeah.
Like, someone's gonna tune in and listen to us talk, what is a JRPG? Should we use this term? They're gonna be like, is the game fun?
Yeah.
That's all they really care about.
That's the benefit of staying in touch, I think, with casuals. Casual too has such like a dirty connotation thanks to the hardcore crowd. But I always tell people, actually on a lot of podcasts, like, you and I are not the average consumer in gaming. We're not the ones that are appealed to. We're not the ones that are being targeted by demographics and market research and anything like that, very rarely. We're a niche group. Like, most people do not get on the internet every day and talk about video games. They just don't. And like, you may be talking about like thousands and thousands and thousands of people, but that's a fraction of how many people play video games. So staying in touch with the casual crowd, I think, is really good. It's healthy. If you're not going to be sort of like bigoted about it. People are like, oh, filthy casuals. Yeah, get over it. It's okay. That's a theme of this discussion. It's okay. It'll be all right. But you know what? I wanted to ask you something. You said earlier that like using JRPGs in a broad term, fine. Using JRPGs when you get down into like the nitty gritty specifics, it kind of falls apart. What's like a specific example of a game that you could think of in which that's the case, if you can think of one?
Like, in terms of how the game plays, it's not going to matter. It's just in terms of like describing what your game is to people who want to buy it. Like, Sea of Stars, if all they told me was JRPG, that wouldn't have done anything.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah.
But where they do cite things like Chrono Trigger, that tells me something about their game. That's something I can grab onto.
Right. So, yeah, that just comes down to the fact that like JRPG isn't the only description. it's one. It has its uses, but it's not the only useful term, and that's a good thing. We've got multiple descriptions, so that you can tell what a game's like. Fortunately, these days too, there's an innumerable ways to experience a game before you decide to buy it or not. You can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it on Twitch, you can play demos, you can you can illegally download it. I'm not telling people to do that, but there are ways to experience a game before buying it. So I don't think that that's a huge issue. Some people, who are flat out eradicatory with the term JRPG, I think are just making too big of a deal about it.
For being entirely honest, whether we keep the term or not, I don't think is actually going to change much of anything.
Yeah, and I don't think
But
like gaming
yeah.
is too big now and too old to eradicate the term. Like, there's no way you would. People are going to be, starting to play games for the first time and stopping playing games and coming in from all kinds of angles around the planet. There's no way to stop using the term JRPG.
Yeah.
I think a person can personally stop using the term, but it's not going away. Like, there's just no way.
Yeah. Again, I like using it, again, the same way anime gets used. It's interesting to see, like, the cultural differences that come about between it. It's just, if you're going to make and advertise a game to me, just give me something more.
Right.
Get
and
specific,
they should.
tell me about it. If saying JRPG isn't explaining to me anything about what you're doing, just drop that and be more concise.
Right.
In those specific instances.
I can't think of a game that was marketed by only saying this is an RPG, a JRPG. I can't think of one.
I know I've seen some, like, smaller projects do it.
Yeah, like,
it's very small studios generally.
I watched a Kickstarter that told me the game is like another game, like it was like a Zelda-like or something like that. I was like, did you even tell me the title? But, like, I cannot think of any single game that's being marketed where all they say is it's a JRPG. Because if they show you footage, like, you're gonna see the battle system, you're gonna see, some sense of art design, you're gonna see something.
I mean, I've seen some trailers for games where, just because it's interesting comparing like a game to a movie, because just because what you're seeing on screen, you might be able to, like, draw some inferences. But once the controller's in your hand, there's so many different ways you could get that exact same effect on screen.
Yeah. No, I think that's
but depending on how much of it is automated, you could it could look like it's an action RPG. But when you have a controller in your hand, you're like, oh no, this is just a turn-based RPG. They're just doing all of that themselves.
Yeah, and
so there are times you need more specificity for that, but that's a different topic entirely.
Right. Given that there are certainly outliers, and again, I would just say, like, those are exceptions to a general rule.
So at the end of the day, I don't think we really disagree on all that much on this topic.
No, it's a topic that is unnecessarily controversial. And again, I think a lot of that was fueled by a certain recent developer who claimed it's discriminatory, and it's definitely fueled by 10 or 15 year old mainstream games journalism from the West.
Again, there are people who were introduced to the term purely from that. I understand the disdain for the term. Like, if that's all I knew it from, I'd hate it too.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely. And I would encourage, if that person, if that's you, I would just say, like, forget, like, what was it, X-Play or something from, like, 10 or 15 years ago?
God,
I was like, you realize people are still making, like, games journalism today. Like, there are people who write about games. Like, for me, I've been writing about games for 12 years. I don't use the term JRPG in a discriminatory fashion. So picking like the worst actor that you can think of in the past 2 decades uh, isn't super compelling. I think. Yeah, they were bad, but they don't represent everybody.
Yeah. I will say, well, again, though, that was for some people where the term came from for them. And it was
Yeah,
a good number of those online outlets that were doing
like the
it.
first time they
But
heard it, right?
yeah, and it was from a lot of different outlets. It's actually crazy to think how little some of this has changed over the years.
Yeah, and that's
But
where I
yeah.
would fall back on. We need historical definitions for these terms, not not ones based on you know a misuse of the term in journalism somehow, because there's too much potential for misuse and abuse in
Yeah.
that sphere for sure, because their job is to be sensational and sell magazines or get clicks and stuff like that, and so they're gonna say hyperbolic things.
Like, oh god, I still remember X Play back in the day. This is the one thing I remember about X Play. They spent the entire review of some game, I don't remember what it was, saying nothing but bad things about it. 4 out of 5
Yeah,
stars. Like, what?
yeah, it's so weird. I don't get it. I didn't watch that sort of thing back then, so like maybe that's why I don't have as much of a problem with it, because I wasn't consuming that crap anyway. So, and
Like,
that's the solution. Like if it bothers you, just ignore it. There are plenty of people who are using the term in good faith rather than bad.
I will say, there was some stuff back on G4 TV back in the day that was worth watching. Like, this entire show you're on now kind of took its inspiration from Judgment Day, an old show back on G4 TV, which was the best review show they had.